Okay, welcome everybody to our webcast today with Dr. Judith Grisel on the impact of isolation on addiction. And I think we all understand what interesting times we live in and how we're having quarantine fatigue and all the things that are a component of our new normal, or our next normal is what I've heard it referred to. I'm Miriam Good. I'm Executive Director of the Mind Science Foundation. We're in San Antonio, Texas. Mind Science is a private operating foundation with a mission to fund early career researchers conducting innovative brain research that will lead to improvements in the health and well-being of humankind. We do this through our Brainstorm Neuroscience Pitch Competition. You can check that out on our website, www.mindscience.org. And we're also committed to funding valuable educational programs like this to help you realize the richer, more meaningful life that we all want. Now, as we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping. If you want to say hi by clicking and saying hello on the chat button, that would be great. And remember to reply to all panelists and attendees so we can see you. If you have a specific question as we go along, please ask that by clicking on your Q&A button. And if you're not able to stay the entire time, a link to download a recording of this talk will be made available to you. So, Dr. Grisel, it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion. Dr. Grisel is an internationally recognized behavioral neuroscientist and a professor of psychology at Bucknell University in Pennsylvania with an expertise in pharmacology and genetics. Her research focuses on determining the root causes of drug addiction. A current focus of her lab is to understand the role of gender differences in different trajectories of alcohol abuse in men and women. Professor Grisel recently published Never Enough, the Neuroscience and Experience of Addiction, which is a beautiful memoir and also scientific read that was a New York Times bestseller, an NB Book of the Month, and a Goodreads Choice 2019 finalist. In addition to academic publications, she has published work in the popular press, was an invited presenter at the Gordon Research Conference, and has been featured on NPR's Fresh Air. Welcome, Dr. Grisel.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Really nice.
Great. Well, to get started, and I should mention that you are going to come back. We don't know if it'll be in person or another full-length webinar to talk more fully about your book and your work. But to get us started, would you please explain the basic neuroscience of addiction?
Sure. I think I could talk about that for a month straight, but I'm going to try to keep it in a few minutes. Addiction occurs because the brain adapts to chronic exposure to drugs, and it adapts to those drugs by producing the opposite effect of the drugs in order to maintain an internal stable state called homeostasis. So people have probably heard of homeostasis in terms of things like body temperature, where we know that if you get much hotter than 98.6, then you sweat to get rid of some extra heat. And if you get colder, then you generate heat by shivering. So we have to have this stable internal state for our body temperature and for all kinds of physiological processes in order to stay alive, basically. Well, it turns out we need the same kind of homeostasis, the same kind of stable state for our feeling states. If we inflate our feeling states with drugs of abuse, which is why we take them to feel better than normal, that's not really good for our survival because we can't tell if something actually good happens, life-sustaining, for instance, or if something terrible happens, you know, if there's some danger and we're just sitting there feeling, you know, blissed out. So what the brain does, and it's really excellent at this, is it counteracts the effects of chronic drugs to come back to this baseline state. So for instance, I'm a recovering drug addict, and I you know, enjoyed as many drugs as I could get my hands on for about 10 years. But now all I really use is caffeine, and I use it regularly. I'm kind of a fiend. I have special pots and special beans and all of this. Anyhow, if I wake up in the morning, I don't really wake up. You know, I open my eyes and my first thought is literally coffee. My pets, my spouse, my child, and nobody really talks to me until I've had a half a cup of coffee, because I can't put a sentence together. So I don't wake up. My brain is knowing that every morning she loads up with caffeine, and so it produces lethargy, so that with the caffeine, I feel just about normal. And that's true with all mind-altering chemicals. The brain produces the opposite effect so that you're tolerant and dependent.
So I have a question. So do other troublesome or addictive behaviors like overeating or gambling that don't involve ingesting a substance, do they fall under the same brain model of addiction?
They can. One thing, beside the fact that the brain counteracts all addictive drugs to produce homeostasis, causing dependence and addiction, all addictive drugs and processes like gambling or overeating or maybe even social media updates and addictive drugs share a common neurobiology, and that neurobiology involves the neurotransmitter dopamine, which probably many of the listeners have heard about. And dopamine in a particular area of the brain, in the center of the brain, causes a feeling of pleasure and interest and intrigue and excitement. Some of us are more inclined to seek that feeling than others. Some of us are naturally satisfied more easily than others, and therefore less likely to kind of step on the pedals of drugs or other kinds of things. But we know that food, especially certain kinds of food, chocolate and hot sauce, for instance, can release dopamine. We know that gambling can release dopamine, and any kind of sort of exciting news can release dopamine. So those things can be addictive. And if you're not certain, you can do the sort of caffeine test I just implied, that you could just put away your social media for a couple weeks or your habits and see how you can still eat but avoid the really delicious stuff, and it's easy. I think that, going back to the food thing, the head of the National Institute of Drug Abuse, Nora Volkow, thinks that food addiction, overeating, and obesity or bulimia, and maybe even anorexia might be a sort of just another version of addiction.
Oh, it's so interesting. And so now, when I think of this time of isolation that we're in, and I have this kind of yearning and for like the familiar foods of my childhood and the macaroni and cheese and all that fun stuff, I always wonder about that. So thinking about isolation, can you talk a little bit about why isolation, and also like this loss of my familiar routines? Like I work from home, I'm dressing differently. So many things are different. Can you talk about how that plays into or is a threat to sobriety, or might somebody who's not presently dealing with an addiction might be pushed towards that?
Sure. I just want to come back to the food thing because I thought to say one other thing. I think the way I can tell for myself if I have an addiction or not is whether or not I can get enough. And,
Oh.
sometimes when I eat, I feel nourished and satisfied. And sometimes that satisfaction is very temporary. And for me, macaroni and cheese actually just reminded me of this. It sort of sets up a thing where I can't quite get enough. So carbohydrates are not so, alcohol's a simple sugar
Yeah.
too. And so I think that in some ways it's similar. So the it's dangerous. But I guess the routine, it's really stress that we're talking about. And I
Mhm.
think part of the stress is having the routine so disrupted in such a profound way that really nobody knows what the world's going to look like 10 days from now or their own lives, honestly.
Mhm.
That is as been said before a million times, unprecedented. So with that stress, what are the kinds of things we can do about that? Well, one thing that we typically rely on is a routine. Well, I'm stressed, but I know, I do this and then I do this and then I do this and I pick up the
Mhm.
kids and I make the dinner, kind of putting one foot in front of the other, even though um, it's challenging under times of stress. It is in a way a comfort, almost like a plate of macaroni. Well, that's also gone. And I think many people are struggling with a kind of uh, desire and need to maintain something like a semblance of a normal life, as the normal life really, frankly, is kind of
Mhm.
unraveling. So I think we need to come up with new strategies, including maybe micro routines. There are certain
Mm.
things. It's funny, my husband said to me the other day, he came home for lunch or something, and he said, "Well, have you brushed your teeth?" And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm really falling apart here. I haven't even brushed my teeth at 1 in the afternoon. So now I really make sure because, I mean, nobody's checking, but, some of that is
Yeah.
important, I think.
Yeah. And I also have found, and I know some of us have the great privilege of actually being able to keep working and keep having a paycheck, and I'm so grateful for that, even while we're working from home. And I noticed that about week 4, the kind of the newness or the shock effect wore off, and I was in a new routine just in time to realize I'm going to have to start thinking about what it's going to look like when I go back to work or back to the office. And knowing that that is not going to look the same either. It'll be some modification. So in all of this, what is it about this stress that pushes people towards addictive behaviors?
Mhm.
Besides, like, to me, the obvious is it calms you down, it makes you feel better. But is there more to it than that?
I think coping by using drugs is, looking for ways of coping, including ways that aren't so functional, is just a natural tendency. Um, you know, and trying to sort of scramble to find new ways is part of it. One of the main factors in the epidemic of addiction before COVID hit is increasing stress. And increasing stress is a precipitant for depression and anxiety as well as addiction. So all kinds of psychopathology had been increasing anyway. And then
Mm-hmm.
this is really, adding extra. And I think that what stress is such a funny concept in a way. I remember in graduate school and in my postdoc, spending weeks and weeks trying to figure out what exactly is stress. And we all think we know what it is, but it's such a ubiquitous part of our experience that it affects everything. And if it affects everything, it doesn't really explain anything, except as you suggest that when we're stressed, we look for ways of coping. And an easy way, especially for those people prone to addiction. So I think we should maybe separate people who were like me already in recovery and trying to sustain that recovery with this added stressor. We have to figure out new ways. But it's also really worth noting that even people who haven't been considered addicted or alcoholic or depressed or anxious are now exhibiting symptoms of all of that, and including really an increased use of chemicals to cope. You mentioned, going back to your childhood food, but the alcohol sales have been breaking records, and it's not only because we're home and I guess we can drink while we go to work, but I think people are realizing alcohol is a sedative. It helps us relax. Things are tense. So let's, relax with a little more alcohol. There's also a big increase in the prescriptions of drugs like benzodiazepines, Xanax, and those sorts of drugs, which are more or less alcohol in pill form. So whether or not you have a problem with drugs, you're looking for ways of coping and looking for ways of dealing with stress. And I guess one of the questions that I ask myself is, and I sort of do it little at a time, is, are the strategies I'm employing, are those really helping me or are they not helping me? And I'm looking for the quick route out of this situation, but in both the personal and sort of a social level, there is no quick way out.
One thing that really struck me in reading your book and listening to the audiobook, although I thought I had a basic understanding of the mechanisms of addiction, but one thing you talk about is you go in the book kind of substance by substance and what alcohol does in the brain. And the one thing that struck me was when we have a glass of wine or whatever to calm us down, that the way the brain brings us back in that homeostasis state is to increase anxiety. Yeah. And that explaining why it's this ever escalating, never enough situation. Can you talk just a little bit about how alcohol, and I'm going to stick with just alcohol and maybe tranquilizers or benzos, because those are the ones that I think most people could be struggling with or know somebody struggling with. Can you talk about the way you do in the book about how those bind and attach in the brain and what that process looks like?
Sure. So alcohol and benzodiazepines like Valium and Librium and Xanax and Zolpidem, Ambien, those drugs are all in a big class called sedative hypnotics. And as I said earlier, so they sedate us, they make us relaxed, and hypnosis means sleep. So they're sleep inducing and relaxing. So, nice, comfortable, cushy. But as I said to start, the brain adapts to every drug that you take on a regular basis by producing the opposite effect. I take caffeine to wake up, therefore I can't wake up without it. If I take these drugs to help me relax, the brain will counteract those and does profoundly and quickly in the same way, so that it produces a state of agitation, tension, and anxiety, and insomnia, as a matter of fact. So these drugs are sometimes used as sleep aids, and they work terrific on the short term. So for a few days, It's wonderful, delicious sleep, but after a while, you can't sleep without them. And so because of this fundamental principle of how the brain works. So if you're in the habit of, you used to say have a drink 2 or 3 times a week, but since you're home now, you're having it every day and maybe 2 instead of 1. The reason you're having 2 is because the brain is adapting, and it is counteracting that sedative and hypnotic effect to produce tension and trouble sleeping. And that's sort of as unavoidable as learning is. It's that kind of core. So the ways that happens with these drugs all happen to involve a neurotransmitter GABA. I don't know if you want to get that into it, but every drug that causes relaxation and sedation is a GABA agonist, and GABA is the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain. So it's the primary brake in the brain. It slows everything down, calms it down, makes it, a little loopy. And that's good for us. If we didn't have GABA, we'd be having seizures all the time, for instance, which, by the way, happens when you're withdrawing from alcohol or other sedatives. So these drugs activate GABA. They make you feel extra relaxed. The brain counteracts that by making itself less sensitive to GABA. It actually changes the structure and the function of brain cells of its own self so that it doesn't quite hear the GABA signal so well. And in doing that, when you're drinking or you have a few pills, you feel just right. But when you take those chemicals away, you feel more tense and anxious than normal. And so it's really kind of a bitter truth, but if you can take it or leave it, then you can have it. But if you're developing a habit, that implies that the brain is adapting, and therefore it becomes a need rather than a want or a luxury. And that's dangerous because as I know well, and many people in recovery know well, backing out of that hole is no fun at all.
Yeah. We have a great question here from one of our viewers. Do you think there is a social component that is making addictive behavior acceptable during isolation?
Well, I would say that addictive behavior is statistically normal before isolation, before COVID-19. I don't think people noticed if they weren't addicted, but there's a lot of us struggling with addiction. It's let's see, what is it? 6% of the people in the world who die today die of addiction. And about 1 out of 8 adults in the US is dependent on alcohol. So alcoholism is not rare. It's not unusual. It's just that for many people, they were busy, they were doing things, and that wasn't their particular problem. So it was kind of easy to ignore. For someone like me, it was obvious. I mean, there's hardly a social occasion without alcohol. And now there's more and more reason for smoking marijuana. So I feel like we've been sort of talking out of 2 sides of our mouth. Addiction is terrible, and yet it's so prevalent and maybe increasing. So that increase has kind of been ignored. There's a sort of a famous quote by the head of the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, George Goob. I think it's famous anyway. He said one time, there's 2 ways to become an alcoholic. You can either be born that way or you can drink a lot. And I think those of us that were probably more born that way have already fallen under the sword of alcohol. But those, at home, trying to cope with increased stress are creating changes in the brain that can lead to that situation. So I think the question really was, is this something that has become socially acceptable? I know there's been some jokes And I don't spend a lot of time looking at those so much, but you know, about how we can have our drink while we're at work from our desk at home. Um, and, you know, probably that's not helpful because every brain we know of is sedated and hypnotized in a way by the effects of alcohol. So the brain will counteract it. I also think if you're home and you don't have a job and you don't have money coming in, the stress is much higher. It's higher, you
Right.
know, it's high for all of us, but especially under those circumstances. And people have seen tremendous increases in calls to hotlines. So at the sort of concomitant with the increase in, you know, online sales of alcohol. So in the month of March, I think there was a 17% increase in alcohol sales, and which is $1 million more. And this is, by the way, despite the fact that all the restaurants and bars were mostly closed.
Yeah.
So selling much more alcohol means people are drinking it more and more. And if you're somebody who doesn't have a job, the other thing that's going up at the same time is calls to hotlines. The national helpline from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration had a 5-fold increase in calls during March. So a lot of people are struggling and trying to cope. And I'm, you know, here to tell you personally and from a scientific perspective, medicating with alcohol or other sedatives is a kind of a dead end.
Absolutely. And I'm thinking of like the alternatives, because we know that, or we anticipate that this round of isolation is going to be the first of what will probably wind up being intermittent periods of isolation. So this, at least in the next, and I'm no forecaster, but at least for the next couple of years, we can anticipate some level of isolation being part of our lives. And so we know what doesn't work to help cope. What are your strategies? I know mindfulness and meditation are helpful. Do you have other activities or practices that help you mitigate that stress?
Yeah, and part of those I'm trying to develop, but they come from what I understand about stress. So what is most stressful about stress is the lack of control. So it turns out if you stress 2 people or 2 animals in the exact same way, but one of them knows it's coming or knows, you know, we're going to be socially isolated Tuesday through Thursday, but not on the weekend. That knowledge is a sort of power that makes the stress much less damaging. What's really stressful is an inability to escape from or predict an aversive event. And that is sort of the situation with COVID. So that kind of points to some solutions. And this really, I think, sort of couches all my comments about things we might try. But what we need to do is something that we can control, something that I can feel like I have some volition, because so much of my life has changed against my will, against my knowledge. I don't even know, you know, it's just so scary. So doing something is much better than doing nothing. And so literally being active, and this is hard for me. I am somebody who's more inclined to sit on the couch and drink, you know, naturally, but just forcing myself to move. And, you know, the more I force myself, the easier it becomes. So I have a daughter who's decided that we're going to do 30 minutes of exercises. And so, you know, I was just trying to help her. And so now I'm doing it, and that's been helpful. And it's partly because I'm choosing to do it. But even taking a walk, I think, is a really useful thing to get outside if you're in a place you can, or anything just to do. I also think, on the other hand, having good sleep hygiene has been really helpful for me. So one of the tendencies in the beginning was, wow, I don't have to be at work at any particular time. I'll just stay up late. That, it turns out, for many reasons, is really counterproductive. So there's amazing evidence about our mood states, including depression and anxiety, and our sleep cycles. And they're so intertwined that having a bad circadian cycle, which is one that's characterized by sort of a haphazard schedule, and naps, is really promoting depression and anxiety. So for me, I had to set my alarm. I get every once in a while in a little bad rut because I stay up too late, and I have to make sure I get up early and kind of get back on schedule, because that will help my mood and my sense of control. I've been trying to develop some new hobbies. I've been enjoying the time to cook, which I don't usually put at the top of my list because I have things I'd rather do, but now I'm making that kind of a mindfulness thing. I am spending time looking at something really slowly, which is a kind of meditation, or even walking really slowly, just sort of noticing where I am, and or listening. It's, lots of songbirds around my area right now, and so I, spending 5 or 10 minutes just hearing what's around me is a way for me to connect with myself and connect with the world, that gives me a sense of myself and the world that's kind of bigger than just COVID.
And I just want to ask if y'all in the chat want to chime in with what you're doing to mitigate the stress that you might be under, that we'd love to hear from you. And we do have a question. If all brains react the same way, why do some people become alcoholics while others do not?
Fantastic.
That's a great question.
That's so great. That's what I would say is like the purpose of my career, to try to understand that. So there are 3 causes probably of addiction, or 3 kind of streams of influence. One is genetic, what we inherit from our parents. And there are differences in the liability that are coming directly from our genes. So some people are more inclined, related to natural variation in dopamine levels and natural variation in GABA receptors, for instance, and other neurotransmitters and pathways and circuits. They're more inclined to find drugs really pleasurable than others. And it's really amazing. If you, with alcohol, the people who are most prone to addiction are those who, from the beginning, have low toxic effects, so they don't get sick so much, they don't get wheezy so much, they feel euphoric, they can hold their alcohol. Those people are the ones who are more at risk than someone who's sort of a cheap date. In a way, that's a big protection. So there's a big, complicated, probably 50 or 100 genes, all contributing either some risk or some protection. And then there are environmental influences like stress, for instance. Also like what you're exposed to, also related to stress, opportunities. So for people who have opportunities for other kinds of things, which many of us have fewer of today than we did, 8 months ago, then that is a trigger. And then finally, there's a big role of developmental influences. So any early use, in my case, I started drinking when I was 13. That's almost a guarantee. Not quite, but people who start early really set the brain for an addictive risk. And also early trauma. We know that problems in the family, neglect or abuse or discord of any kind, those sorts of things really have an impact on a developing brain that makes it more likely that the child will then pick up to cope early on and find that coping a big relief. In other words, they need a relief. And if you take your relief in drugs, then the brain changes to maintain homeostasis in a way that is kind of permanent. So the environment, developmental factors, and genetics all kind of collude to determine your risk. But again, especially with a drug like alcohol, you know, some people don't like it that much, and those are protected. The ones that do like it are at risk. And what we find in a situation like this is more and more people are liking it. They're coming to appreciate alcohol's ability to relieve the stress and give a little break to the day. And that's a kind of a slippery slope.
Right. I want to, we're coming to the end of our time together. Ask for any other questions, but I would like you, while we're waiting for some questions to come in, talk a little bit about why your decision-making process and why you chose neuroscience as your career. I know what the answer is, and it's a great, I mean, I love how you tell this story in the book, and I would love for you to share that with our viewers.
Yeah, sure. Well, sort of the 20,000 foot view is that if you're not drinking and using, there's a lot of other things you could do that might be more productive, but it's not that admirable. So I started using at 13. I spent 10 years taking as much alcohol and everything else that I could. And as a result of that, things went downhill fast. I ended up in treatment. And when I got there, they said, you're killing yourself. You're going to die if you don't quit. And they recommended abstinence. And like every good addict, I thought, no way. You know, there's got to be a back door here somewhere. You know, I've escaped a lot of dangerous situations, and I didn't really want to live without drugs. So I came up with this scheme that sounds hilarious to me now, and I appreciate how cute I am, but I said, well, I'm going to fix it. You know, if I have a disease that's killing me, like cancer or other diseases, you know, diseases can be cured. So I'm going to come up with a cure for my problem. I thought I would find the bad switch in my brain and, you know, turn it in the other direction so that I could use without self-destructing, which was hilarious because I had been kicked out of 3 schools. I didn't, you know, I had no, if you looked at me from the outside, you would think this person has no promise whatsoever. But I was determined, and that is a quality that, you know, characterizes addiction and addicts, but it also makes people good grad students. So I ended up, just by sheer will, really, pursuing it took me 7 years to get my bachelor's, 7 years in grad school. I did a postdoc, blah, blah. And my goal for much of that was to cure addiction so I could use. My life got much better without drugs. And even though it was hard, I found the research really exciting and a decent substitute. I think recovering addicts make fabulous scientists, or, you know, anything that involves a lot of risk and uncertainty is kind of appealing to me. And so, you know, I was really lucky.
We have a question here on, is there a switch?
No, there's no switch, unfortunately. It's what we know is that the brains of people like me are different from the brains of people who don't have addictive tendencies. So there's definitely a neural liability, and also people who are protected neurally. For instance, this is an easy example, but about a third of the population don't like opioids at all. You know we have an opioid problem, but it's not equally likely for everybody. Same with alcohol, same with all drugs. So that is a confluence of lots of factors, including the genes, the developmental, and the environmental factors, and each of those is really dense. So you'd have to find a lot of switches. I don't personally think that's likely. I do find it really encouraging that we have been able to understand what's different before and during and after, developing an addiction. And so we are better and better able to predict the risk factors, and we now know, as Miriam and I have been talking about, that stress and using your drug as a tool to cope is kind of a way into addiction.
And I think we have one more question going back to when you were talking about GABA and how chemical substances can turn that off or change it.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to turn it off.
I mean, not
seizures. No, I think I may have been unclear, but go ahead with the question.
I think the question behind that is, are these changes that happen in the structure and the functionality in the brain because of addiction? Does the brain's plasticity allow it to revert to its original state, or is there lasting damage? Absolutely. Or both?
Both. But with GABA, absolutely, it will revert. So it's just an incredible story, the GABA receptor that alcohol interacts with and drugs like Xanax, benzodiazepines interact with. That receptor is made of 5 different proteins, and those proteins all come from different genes. And so 5 different genes, in other words, go to make this one receptor. And there are many versions of those genes. So at one point I did the math on this, and theoretically, at least, there's about 170,000 different types of GABA receptors, which is unbelievable. And those vary partly as a result of our development, and partly as a result of what we inherit, partly as a result of where in the brain they're found, which particular structures, but largely also by our experience. So if you're a regular drinker, or somebody who has a stress disorder, or someone who's ovulating for that matter, your GABA A receptors are changing. And they're very plastic. And the half-life of a receptor, so how long they stay around, is only a few days. So you're constantly making new ones, and the brain is making new ones in anticipation of what you're about to do so that it can be ready. It's so, it really helps us prepare. I know, it's a gorgeous story. I love that. It's so elegant. Yeah. And so these are changing all the time. In fact, if you go to have surgery, and one of the questions they'll ask is, how much do you drink? Because if you're a big drinker, they know they need to give you more anesthetic. That's partly due to the brain, partly due to the liver changes, because the liver also adapts, although maybe in a simpler way. So yes, you can. Now, on the other hand, alcohol is toxic, neurotoxic. And we now know that drinking is bad for the brain, for sure. It's not good at all. And it, damages the brain. And some of that is not reversible. That's not necessarily due to the direct effects on GABA. Oh.
Great. Well, I think we are just about ready to wrap this up. And I know we really could talk about this for another hour or two. But I do want to thank you, Dr. Grisel. This has been fabulous. And remind everybody that Dr. Grisel, whether it's in person in San Antonio or via another webcast, we will have her back to talk really more in depth and at length on other substances and dive a little bit deeper into the mechanisms of addiction. But thank you again. Everybody hang in there. Go create your own new routines, be healthy and be well. And we will send you the links for a download. Thank you again, everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Okay,
Oh, it's a
bye-bye.
pleasure. Bye.